As Canada reckons with centuries of colonialism, how is it treating Indigenous children today? Many advocates point to the foster care system as a continuation of the same motives that led to the residential school system. More than 50% of children in the foster care system in Canada are Indigenous, despite Indigenous children making up only 7% of the youth population in Canada. The 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Report called for information about the proportion of Indigenous children within the foster care system to be made public. But in Montreal, we do not have statistics of how many children are Indigenous within the system. In the 94 calls to action by the TRC, the first 5 are reserved for the foster care system, including the demand to reduce the number of Indigenous children within this system. The TRC is not the only report to call on this. The Viens Commission released a report in 2019, and the Laurent Commission released a report in 2021, both focused in Quebec, detailing how Indigenous children, and Inuit children in particular, are being failed within the foster care system. Naguset, the executive director of the Native Women's Shelter, says that the Native Women's Shelter and Batshaw Youth and Family Centres, located in Westmount, formerly had a collaboration agreement. It was signed in 2013 to improve services that Indigenous children and families received from Batshaw. Naguset said this collaboration ended when Batshaw merged with the CIUS.
How do you make the youth protection more indigenized? Well, you let us in the door. You allow us to have a conversation. We are not even there yet. Batshaw has an Aboriginal team. So they have so many kids in care that they actually have a team, but there's no one Indigenous running that team.
Batshaw has recently come under fire after an Indigenous teen was forced to self-isolate in a windowless basement room where the teen had no access to books and their cell phone had been confiscated. In 2018, sources identified that within 2 group homes run under Batshaw and the CIUS, several youth were told not to speak Inuktitut to one another. Staff said that this was a safety issue in order to know if they were planning to run away or cause harm. Local 514 reached out to Batshaw to request an interview. However, they were not available for an interview before the publication of this report. Racism and cultural misunderstanding has not only been directed at children, but at Indigenous parents as well.
We at the Native Women's Shelter have a worker called the family care worker, and she's had a conversation with youth protection where the social worker told her, oh, this Inuk woman, I don't believe she doesn't speak English. I think she's faking it. Or maybe if she's not faking it, she drank too much and she's just brain dead. So when an institution feels comfortable talking that way about an Inuk woman, that's a problem. And that is rampant in the foster care system.
A recommendation in One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, a report co-authored by Naguset focused on child welfare services for Indigenous communities in Montreal, states that employing more Indigenous staff is a necessity in order to improve the well-being of Indigenous children and reduce racism and colonial practice within the system.
I've known other Indigenous people that worked at Batshaw and basically cried every single day and then quit. So if you want Indigenous people to come in and work there, you need to be culturally supportive.
The Laurent report, which was released in early May, identified the cultural gap between youth protection workers and Indigenous families, which ultimately negatively affect these families as this contributes to discrimination and overrepresentation of Indigenous children within the system.
A lot of the youth protection, they don't understand what SAGE is. So they go into someone's home who's smudged and say, oh, this client was smoking pot. And that shows up in the court system. Even though the social worker and the woman says, no, I'm just smudging. I'm just using SAGE. Later on, it showed up in the courts that they did a visit and they smelt of pot. So, and when I talked to, youth protection about this, they were like, well, I don't know what SAGE is, so I can understand. I'm like, well, then, educate yourself. Like, seriously, like, why is it our job to educate you? Where is your will to make the steps to know better? Why is there this, resistance?
Larry DePoe, Interim Executive Director for the Rising Sun Childcare Center, a daycare in Verdun, run by Indigenous workers for Indigenous children, says that the system is a continuation of colonialism.
We feel very strongly that the foster care system with Indigenous people is a throwback or a vestige of colonialism, that as long as Indigenous peoples do not have control over their own families, their own fostering systems, that this is just a repeat of the colonial past of Quebec and Canada.
So why can't Indigenous communities be in control of their own foster care system? Federal Law C-92 allows for Indigenous communities to create their own child welfare systems.
Our government is investing $542 million to Indigenous communities to exercise full jurisdiction over child and family services. This is vital to moving forward on our promise to address the unacceptable injustices that too many kids and families have faced in the care system.
However, the Legault government has exempted this law in Quebec. Local 514 reached out to the Minister for Health and Social Services, Lionel Calmont, and the Indigenous Affairs Minister, Ian Lafreniere. However, we did not receive a response before the publication of this interview. The Native Women's Shelter is trying to find a way around Quebec exempting Law C-92.
We were actually in the process of doing a proposal on how we can start changing the system. And it was like a 3-tiered project, and a lot of research component inside, but at the end of the project, then actually having the research to say, these are the recommendations and this is what we can do.
This proposal includes a mentorship program pairing Indigenous youth with an Indigenous mentor, the creation of an advisory committee to develop training and recommendations used to educate those working within the foster care system, offering a youth protection support worker to educate workers within the system of the impacts of colonialism and residential schools on families, among other essential improvements to the system. The goal of this is to generate solutions within the foster care system that are informed by those with lived experience.
I think that the history of this country has shown just recently how little most white people know about the history of what's happened with Indigenous peoples in this country. So yes, there's a lack of knowledge for people working in that system in terms of being able to understand Indigenous culture, Indigenous living, and so on, and a tremendous amount of misunderstanding.